Somebody tell me, what is a romantasy book that has actually done fantasy right? Except for Throne of Glass. That one was pretty good. Should fantasy and romance stay in separate lanes? I know romantasy is having its moment right now. BookTok can't get enough of it. Your local bookstore has an entire wall dedicated to it. And half the fantasy releases this year have been some variation of morally gray love interest with wings meets sassy girl who doesn't know she's magically special. But when did fantasy become less about the fantasy and more about whether the MMC is going to pin the FMC up against the wall? Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-romance. Romance is great, fantasy is great, but somewhere along the way, we've created this monster hybrid that's slowly eating away at everything that made fantasy great in the first place. So let's talk about some ways that romantasy is changing fantasy, and not necessarily for the better. If you're new here, my name is Brianna and I post videos every Sunday that help you become a better writer. I also make easy-to-use writing workbooks that help you build and outline your novel from start to finish, so if you're interested, check them out in my Etsy shop, Planner.co, linked in the description below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. And before you come for me in the comments, I'm not dragging on romantasy as a genre. I'm criticizing popular book talk and how it's basically become this avenue to engage in toxic high school mean girl clique culture obsessed with low-level books rather than promoting higher-level books that foster a healthy literary discussion. And I'm not saying you shouldn't read low-level books. In our exhausting world, we need a bit of escapism now and then. But when a platform you follow is only promoting low-level books, or when you're only reading and consuming low-level books that don't challenge you in some way or don't even strive to achieve something similar to, say, a Tolkien book, you're letting your mind become stagnant. A medium that should challenge you and push you to grow intellectually becomes text-based TikTok. Text talk. Like, I was on Wattpad 24/7 as a kid. I read all the hot mess books on there, but that's not all I've read, and it's not all you should read either. Anyway, I digress. I'm rambling. So let's talk about some of the problems that I've seen in romantasy books. Romantasy is both romance and fantasy, which means it should achieve an equal presence of both in the book. So the problems that I'm going to be talking about in this video are problems that are happening because the writer is paying too much attention to the romance aspect and too little attention to the fantasy side. So let's start with problem number 1. The world becomes nothing more than a pretty backdrop for the romance. Traditional fantasy used to be about the world first, the characters second, think Tolkien, Brandon Sanderson, or even early Game of Thrones. The magic system mattered, the politics mattered, the history and culture and languages, they all served the overall story. But what I've seen in romantasy is that usually the world often exists solely to create romantic tension. You've got your standard fake court with inexplicably modern gender politics, or your dragon riders who somehow have time for extensive foreplay between saving the world. Or the magic system conveniently activates when the main character needs it the most. Or when the political intrigue is just an excuse to throw the main characters together to be in close proximity. Now I want to caveat that if you're writing a fantasy romance rather than a romantasy, then you can get away with having your world as just a backdrop. I talk about this more in another video I made explaining the two differences between the genres, but the gist is that in fantasy romance, the romance and relationship takes priority over the fantasy. However, in romantasy, it's an equal balance. One should not take priority over the other. So let's say your protagonist has powers that get stronger when she's in love and gets weaker when she's heartbroken. You can do that in fantasy romance because having powers tied to romantic feelings actually makes total sense given that romance is the primary engine of the story. The magic system should support the main plot, which is the romance. However, in romantasy, this would not work. Because when you have magic systems that only exist for romantic convenience, then you're undermining the fantasy elements that should be driving your story. What would a master world builder like Robin Hobb or N.K. Jemisin do? Their romantic subplots bolster the way we as readers experience the world because they ground us in something we all know, love. But it doesn't replace the world. The romance feels authentic because it grows out of the characters' shared experiences as they journey throughout a fully realized world, not the other way around. Problem number 2, and this is a big one, I think maybe 90% of every female protagonist I've read in a romantasy book has literally been the same person, just with different hair. She's spunky but doesn't know her own power. She's not like other girls but also completely relatable to all the girls reading the book. She's got attitude for days but melts the second her love interest does anything remotely interesting. She's usually an orphan or has some sort of absentee parent, usually has a prophetic destiny, and definitely has trust issues that can only be healed by the right man's magical attention. And what kills me is that she's always surprised by how attractive she is. Despite having every supernatural hottie in the land obsessed with her, she's constantly thinking about how plain and unremarkable she is. Meanwhile, she's got a vampire prince, a werewolf alpha, maybe a dragon shifter, all vying for her attention. And not only that, but the whole I love a good enemies to lovers story. It's great. Love it. It's, chef's kiss if done right. But usually it's not done right, especially when your characters are constantly saying, I hate you, kiss me. Traditional fantasy gave us complex characters like Logan Ninefingers, Kaladin Stormblessed, even Persephone from the Legends of the First Empire series. These characters had real flaws, real growth arcs, and real stakes beyond their love lives. They're memorable because they're unique and they act based on who they are at their core, not because they need to fit into some cookie-cutter protagonist profile. Romantasy protagonists should strive to achieve the same. The third problem is allowing the emotional focus to shift away from supposedly urgent stakes, and usually in this case it means going from, oh no, the world is about to end, to, oh no, the guy that I love is right there, and oh my gosh, I need to focus on him completely, my love. I'm talking about those scenes where the world is ending, people are dying, there's some sort of magical apocalypse happening, and right there, in that moment, the protagonists decide that it's the perfect time for either an internal monologue about their feelings for the love interest or an actual discussion with each other about it. I mean, sure, I love that scene in Dead Man's Chest when Elizabeth and Will get married while having this intense sword fight on a pirate ship. But that's a movie, and oftentimes when writers try to mimic a scene like that, they aren't able to do it well, and it weakens the scene. Maybe even the story overall if they do it more than once. The dragon army is at the gates, but sure, let's stop to analyze why he's been avoiding me all week and whether or not he really loves me. And it's not just the timing, it's the priorities. In traditional fantasy, the romantic tension builds alongside the main plot, it highlights the story. But what I've seen in Romantasy is that oftentimes the romance becomes the plot, with everything else just happening around it. The war, the magic, the political intrigue, they all become just obstacles that keep the love interests apart until they can finally be together. I miss fantasy, where the romance bolstered the story instead of hijacking it, where characters fell in love because they respected each other's competence and strength, not because magical bonds or destiny forced them together. Problem number 4 is when the magic systems exist solely to create romantic plot devices. Mate bonds, soul bonds, magical connections that basically override free will and personal choice. Magic that only works when you're emotionally vulnerable. Powers that can only be controlled through physical contact. A good magic system should have rules, limitations, and logical consequences. It should create interesting problems and solutions for your characters, but oftentimes romantasy magic tends to be whatever is convenient for the romantic plot at the moment. If you need your love interest to be forced together, oh, it turns out they have a soul bond that they need to break. If you want them to share intimate moments together, make it so that the magic forces them to be in physical contact together. If you want to create artificial drama, make the magic go haywire every time they fight. Now compare that to something like Brandon Sanderson's Allomancy or Patrick Rothfuss's Sympathy Magic. These systems have clear rules, interesting applications, and create genuine conflict and resolution. The magic serves the story, not the romance, because magic should exist outside of a romance. And problem number 5 is when the villains are just love interests who didn't get picked. How many romantasy villains are actually just attractive men who wanted the protagonist but didn't get to have them? They're not evil because they have complex motivations or philosophical differences than the heroes. They're evil because they represent the wrong choice in a love triangle. This creates such a shallow approach to conflict. Instead of villains with real stakes, real motivations, and a real threat level, we get brooding, pretty boys who are only dangerous because they might steal the protagonist away from the other love interest. The villain's entire plan revolves around winning the girl, not actually trying to accomplish something meaningful to them. Traditional fantasy gave us villains like Sauron or the Dark One or the Lord Ruler, all having their own goals, their own motivations, and posing a real danger to the characters in the world. Or overarching problems like the Blight or the White Walkers. These are all threats that exist independent of the protagonist's love life. Again, I'm not saying romantasy is inherently bad. Romance is a great companion to fantasy, and some of the best fantasy novels have an incredible romantic subplot. The problem is when the romance completely overshadows everything that makes fantasy special. What we need is balance, like anything and everything in life. We need fantasy that can have swoon-worthy romance without sacrificing complex world building, unique characters, sensible magic systems, and compelling conflicts. We need protagonists who are interesting beyond their romantic potential and love interests who better the story rather than becoming the entire point of it. I mean, wouldn't the romance be even more satisfying if it grew out of characters who were already interesting on their own, in a world that felt real and rich and lived in, facing stakes that mattered beyond their relationship status? So, is romantasy ruining fantasy? I think it's more complicated than that. Romantasy is popular right now because it's giving readers something that they want. Escapism, wish fulfillment, emotional, maybe physical satisfaction. But in the process, we might be losing some of what made fantasy special in the first place. The good thing is that it doesn't have to be that way. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, you might want to watch this one next. And if you want some help balancing your own romantasy novel, check out my romantasy world building workbook on my Etsy shop linked in the description below. Until the next chapter.